static beat. Every ounce of blood's a fuzz to me.
Okay, so this week, this is the second part of our three-part series on stories and storytelling narratives. And the title here on the screen, What's the Deal with Narrative Genres? I want to, right off the bat, say that I'm not talking about all narrative genres here. When I'm talking about narrative genres, I'm specifically talking about narrative genres that are considered to be accounts of the past, that help us understand the past, that deal with our memories of what came before, collectively, as a culture. So, I'm not necessarily talking about poetry or the novel or other kind of literary genres. I'm talking about history, myth, legend. I used to think that history was a synonym for the past. That's how we use the word colloquially. What is the history of this object or of this building? It has something to do with the past. And so I assumed that historians, what they do is they're writing about the past. Of course they are. But there's more to it than that. So I minored in history in my grad program, and I entered it with this set of associations or assumptions, and I quickly realized that what professional historians are doing is quite different than what I thought they were doing. So I was thinking about history like a folklorist. I was thinking about how do we collectively understand what happened before? How do we tell those stories? How do we renew and transmit those stories? How do we make sense of them? How do we see them in the world around us today? The very first day of my very first history class at the graduate level, we were asked to sort of do a little journal reflection on what we thought of history, why we were interested in it, what drew us to it. And my answers from that journal entry were all very mythos-based. I was thinking about history as a way for us to make sense of where we are based on where we've been, a way to explain the world around us, a set of stories that we collectively tell and maintain and pass on to one another. I was really thinking about history as sort of a broad and ambiguous engagement with the past, ever being renewed, ever being sort of expressed and performed, a sort of frame of folk reference for what happened before for all of us to make sense of our lives with. What I realized in my program is that history is much more narrow and specific than that, modern guild history, what a professional historian is doing today. So they're not just doing an exploration of just what happened before. As an example, when I was in my orientation class for this discipline, somebody was saying for their project they wanted to do a history of lighthouses on the coast. And my professor was saying, that's not really a great subject for a history, because that's, just like what happened isn't really, we're not just recounting what happened in the past. She's like, in order for it to be a history, it really needs to be looking at something that has affected humans and that has changed over time. What I came to realize is that what makes modern guild history, contemporary guild history itself, is this sort of process that historians go through where, first of all, they're specifically interested in, often, change over time. And they're going to be looking at it, I mentioned this last week too, within a really tightly bounded period of years. And then they're going to saturate themselves with the other historical writings on that topic. They're going to absorb everything they can that is known on that topic. And from that process, they're going to identify where are the gaps in what we don't know. They're not so much recounting events as identifying where's the consensus in the argument, where are the gaps of knowledge, where are the debates, and how can I join that conversation? So if there's a gap in knowledge, I might say, this is an area where I could go out and I could generate some knowledge to fill that gap. Or if they see that there's consensus, but they see that there's something about that consensus that's maybe not, that they don't agree with, or they think there's nuance being lost, they might say, this is where I think that we've got it wrong to this point, and they might create a revision. So they look at what has been said to this point, they look at what might have been missed, and then having identified what specifically they want to add to the conversation, from that they formulate a really specific research question, a very tightly scoped question. And my professor was saying what she does is she takes in her Word doc as she's collecting evidence and material and stuff, or doing her writing, she'll take in the header at the top of every page, she'll put in big letters, big highlighted letters, specifically what she is attempting to learn and what she's attempting to prove. And it's there looking at you on every single page, because the next step in the process is to proceed to dive into an archive and read absolutely every scrap of evidence that exists on that topic that could inform that question. And so as you're going through an archive, you're coming up with all kinds of really interesting stuff. And it's really tempting and easy to lose focus. You have to be able to tell what is actually relevant to my research question and what is not. What's maybe something to put in a scrap bin to go through later because it's really interesting and I want to come back to it, but I can't do that now. So she's going to create an argument. In her finished work, what she's going to say is, this is a topic, this is why it matters, this is what is known about it to this point, or this is what scholars have previously believed about this. But what they haven't looked at is, or what they're wrong about is, and then she'll say, I'm going to show by going into these archives and with these methods, I'm going to show X. And essentially what it results in is an argument. They're essentially building a case. A professional guild historian is building a case to say, this is why I think it matters, this is where I think it fits in the debate, and this is my answer to that question based on my tour through the archive. And then they write their book. It's very ordered. It's a social science, right? It's a very formal, disciplined inquiry into a very specific question, right? So very different from what I was assuming, and what I think a lot of us assume. A lot of people love to browse the history shelf in the bookstore without realizing what exactly it is that modern guild historians are doing when they write those works. To dig into that just a little bit more, I want to talk about something called the 5 C's of historical scholarship. This is not representative of all of the depth and drama that is possible while doing historical research, but it is something that can pretty clearly sketch what is the foundation, what are the basic principles or the basic ideas that are probably going to show up in a contemporary historian's work. So the 5 C's are change over time, context, causality, contingency, complexity. Change over time is often the most important C of all the C's in history. A lot of times this is where it's at. The historian is trying to understand. If you had to boil it down into 3 words, you could say something changed. Why? What changed and why did it happen? And specifically, often focused on human change. There is such a thing as environmental history, but most historians are really focused on human experiences, human events. That often is what it hinges on, right? Then we have context. So like in the world of sci-fi or fantasy, you would call this world building. You're creating an image of the water that we're all swimming in. And the water that we swim in is really important because it's kind of the foundation of what things mean. You're trying to create a fabric in which these events took place. There's a web of significance, of things that you need to know about in order to make sense of whatever you're seeing. And that context is coloring in the picture around whatever the main event is that you're studying. Then we have causality. So what specifically was it that caused the change? This is the why, right? Proving causality is really typically difficult in the social sciences. It's really not an easy or straightforward task to say convincingly why something happened. There are so many potential factors involved. Great if you can identify it. Very difficult to identify often, and this is where the rigor comes in building that argument, of creating a convincing argument to your fellow historians to say, I think it was this that caused that change, and how well can you prove that point? Then contingency. So if you can identify a cause, that's great, but any cause, any change is going to be predicated on all of these interwoven factors. These things that if they had not been the case, it would not have happened that way. And so identifying factors of contingency is also a big part of it. And then you have complexity. I don't think I told this story last week, but my mentor, she was told by her mentor, when she came up with a hypothesis about why something happened, her mentor would say, okay, now complicate that. Let's find out how it's more than that, how it's not just black and white, how it's not quite so simple. Pretty much anytime you come up with an idea, a theory, to have that in the back of your mind, to have that like a parrot sitting on your shoulder saying, complicate that, that's part of the work of doing history. This is where you really get beyond the simplistic answer. You're looking deeper. You're looking, as soon as you think you've found it, you're constantly chasing that. How can we nuance this? How can we texture this? How is this true, but also how is it not true? Complicate that. So the historians Thomas Andrews and Flannery Burke, who wrote an article about the 5 C's, the way they describe this is that the 5 C's describe the shared foundations of our discipline. They stand at the heart of the questions historians seek to answer, the arguments we make, and the debates in which we engage. And that was news to me. That was news to me when I was getting into this. I didn't know that right off the bat, and I thought it was pretty fascinating that history writing, in this sense, guild history, when we're talking about guild history, it's not a broad catch-all, like anything dealing with the past is history. No. It's a very specific thing. The reason I go into this is to make clear that history writing is a genre. It's not just a subject, especially when we talk about the way history is done in the present day. The way that a contemporary historian is going about their work is quite different from what Herodotus was doing. They are called by the same name, but they are quite different. The present-day historian is doing something that's very culturally specific. They're proceeding in a culturally specific way that our society has decided is a good way to do history, right? It's a particular game with particular game rules. It's not just a what, it's also a very specific how. And with that said, I want to pivot to myth. Is that applause I heard? Somebody start clapping? That's funny. So we started by saying that history is not just a study of the past, it's more than that. Well, myth is not just a synonym for untrue. And we did talk about this last week, that a lot of times it does have that meaning when we use it in everyday language, oh, that's a myth, or I'm going to myth bust that, right? And that's fine, it can have that meaning, but it also has other meanings, right? Last week, we talked about the historian Jan Bender-Shetler and her work in the Serengeti, and the 2 phrases that she introduced to my vocabulary, which are core spatial images and generative principles. We talked about how she reached to mythology, to oral tradition, to understand events that happened well before the advent of any kind of writing, to find things that are very true, that go way back, that are very old memories. And yes, like our everyday memories, our personal individual memories, these stories are selected. We don't get everything that ever was. We get the ones that the people before us selected and chose to pass on. Whether they did that consciously or unconsciously, they're picking up some things and letting go of others. Like, what are the stories that you heard your parents tell as a child? You probably heard lots and lots of stories, but there are maybe half a dozen, maybe just a couple, that stick in your mind that you have available to tell to your children. So that process of what registered as true and important enough to pass on, that process also takes place collectively. And so it's not that the stories of oral tradition necessarily give us the whole picture. They are selected and pruned, but those events that are held in myth can have tremendous staying power. They can be historically relevant. They can tell us what happened in the past in a very different way from the guild historian, but in a very valuable way. And I will give a couple examples. Last week I mentioned the native story of how there was a flood in this area and the water rose and people got in their canoes and they were floating basically at the tops of the trees. The water rose that far and there's this tremendous image of all of this water in this part of the world. And, very likely that's a memory, a cultural memory, a collective memory of the glacial floods that were coming through as the climate was changing, as the Ice Age was ending and the world was getting warmer and the Holocene was starting. Incredible, mind-bending floods in this part of the world. So those stories kind of hold those images. They're remarkable images and they have a lot of staying power. I personally came across that particular story probably 2 years ago, and it has stayed really fresh in my mind because it's such a powerful image. So tremendous amount of time there. There's also stories that regard to forest fires. These are more recent, but it shows how information can be embedded in stories. Huge fires came through. This was something, I don't know if you know this was news to me when I first heard of it, but in the late 1800s or even through the 1800s and into the 1900s, there were cataclysmic forest fires that came through this region. Just like apocalyptic fires that came through, leveled everything. There's a community out west of Triangle Lake, and the name of the community is Deadwood, and it's called Deadwood because of one of those massive fires. So Native people here had a cultural practice of controlled burns. So they would keep the underbrush cleaned out and pretty low. And during the colonial transition, there was this period of Indian removal where the Native people were removed from the land and they were no longer able to practice their controlled burns. The underbrush in this area grew up very thick. And then 50 years later, what you had is, instead of these kind of park-like trees with lots of space in between, you got all of this undergrowth that just grew up. And, places you had been able to just kind of walk comfortably through, suddenly you kind of can't get through unless you're like crawling and battling all of this brush. And what happens is you get a lightning strike or you get some other source of fire, the whole thing just goes up in flame. So there are stories in Native oral tradition about what happened when the forest fire came. People created heat shields and they buried themselves in the mud and they held up the heat shields and the fire was able to pass over them. And that strategy for surviving a forest fire is captured in the story, in the cultural story, in the myth text, so that when fires happen again, that people who have heard that story, who have that in their knowledge set, they can draw on that, they can reach for that. You have that in your mind and you might be able to save yourself because you have that information from that story. Okay, so that's an example of how myth is not a synonym for untrue. It's very practical knowledge that can be embedded in that. And there's lots of other wonderful examples. In present-day Australia, there's an indigenous people called the Gunditj Mara, and they have a story of a volcano erupting. It's like a creation story or a story of how their society came to be. And they have found evidence of a major volcano eruption that's about 40,000 years old. So when you think about Jen Bender-Shetler talking about generative principles or core spatial images, this like really powerful image that explains how things came to be, and then you think about that story and you think about a historical event, an event of the past that happened 40,000 years ago, that is incredible cultural memory. Again, you can be accessing historical truth that goes back far beyond what we can even wrap our minds around. 40,000 years ago is well into the last ice age, which was ending about 18 or so thousand years ago. So that's incredible. There's also some really interesting work taking place by archaeologists, Western archaeologists, who are recognizing the non-Western archaeology that happens among indigenous people who have land knowledge and have practices around interpreting artifacts that come up in their land in a cultural way, in a non-Western way. Archaeologists who are trained in the Western model there are those who are starting to realize that that's the case and to listen and to collaborate with those culture keepers, with those knowledge holders, right? So there's a place in Papua New Guinea called Orokola Bay where people garden, and as they go to a new place and they garden, they'll unearth these artifacts, pottery, like really old, cultural artifacts, and they have stories about them. They'll like unearth these things and they'll be like, oh yeah, this is from our ancestors, and they have knowledge and memory of things that happened a long time ago about intercultural contact, about migration. So they have that knowledge kind of built into their cultural practice of the stories that they tell and the way that they interpret the land and the things that the land contains. And this is all part of oral tradition, right? One last example before we move on. The Trojan War is very likely another example. The fall of Troy, right, is very likely based in a historical event or even a series of historical events. And so even in what we think of as like classical mythology, there's memory contained in that. There's memory about the past. There's information about the past that's contained in those things. And so these, while very different from history, myth is also a way to engage with the past, a way to unearth truth about the past. So whereas the historian is doing it kind of in this disciplined, almost forensic way, this sort of comprehensive, careful, ordered way. Myth and oral tradition is also unearthing truth about the past, but it's doing it in this completely different paradigm. And neither paradigm is right or wrong. They show different things. They're capable of saying different things, right? That said, when it comes to myth, fact and fiction can be kind of malleable. And I think this is true in any kind of narrative truth. This is a picture of Madagascar, the Malagasy people. One of my favorite anthropologists, David Graeber, did a lot of work among the Malagasy people. And one of the statements that he made about their myths that I love is he said that in their myths, the people grapple with the most fundamental questions of life, love, death, the deepest mysteries of human existence. They are also obviously jokes. People laugh at them, call them the lies of our ancestors, though most also feel on some level that they are also true. There's kind of a like Schrodinger's cat thing going on here with some of these stories, where it's like a story can be, on one hand, a joke, and obviously a tall tale, obviously, fanciful, and also at the same time, literally true. And I think this middle space is important to acknowledge. I think that in the tradition of sort of Western empiricism, where we're like, we tend to, in the mainstream, take a very black and white view on, is it true or is it false? And if it's true, it's a fact and it's scientifically provable and it's verifiable and all that. And if it's false, well, that's also fiction, that's also myth, that's also, and of course in the humanities you have people pushing back and saying, well, no, truth is different than fact. There's truth in fiction, there's truth in a good story, there's truth in poetry, there's truth, so it's not that this is the only definition at play. But we do come up against this all the time of like, are unicorns real or are they not real? And we kind of have to sadly hang our heads and say, well, they're probably just not real. We're dragons or hippogriffs or all this stuff. And I would say it's sort of tricky, but one of the things that I love about folklore is it sort of takes us out of that question, is it or is it not? Which is kind of a disappointing question deep down. Like, I feel like if you prove that it is, it's almost a letdown in a way. It's like, you have this question of like, is it mythical and magical, or is it just part of the world we know? And either way, if you find out that it exists, then that means it's just part of the world we know. And if you find out it doesn't exist, then that means that myth and magic don't exist. And either way is a little bit of a letdown, right? If let's say you live in a world where you didn't think that it was possible for giraffes to exist. Let's think about giraffes for a second. They're wild, right? Like, they should not, like a shape like that, a body shape, like, they're incredible. And if you didn't know empirically that a giraffe could exist, and you saw a picture of a giraffe next to a picture of a unicorn, you'd probably be like, these are both mythological, right? And then if you went to a place where giraffes were living and you saw a giraffe with your own eyes and you verified that it exists, the answer wouldn't be to you, magic is real. The myths were true. You would say, oh, it's real. It's there's an organism called a giraffe in here. You might feel amazed at it, like, whoa, that's so cool. But it wouldn't be that like, oh, magic is real. It would be like, oh, this too is part of the known world and is therefore part of the disenchantment that we all live in as like good empiricists, right? Where we are working very hard to disenchant the world. That either or thinking is disappointing, whether you prove that the mythical beast was real all along and therefore is scientific and we can kind of like have ownership of it and not feel too worried about it. Or if you prove that it never could have existed, like a unicorn, where you're like, oh, all of those horns were actually from narwhals. Like it was all a big hoax, And either way, you're kind of doing something that's feels a little bit disenchanting, And I'm not saying there isn't wonder in the natural world and science and the findings of science and all of that. Like obviously there very clearly is, but there's an impulse to try to disenchant what we are seeing or what's presented to us. Right? As long as we're sort of sorting things into either of those categories, we're doing what I think is a less interesting thing than really taking the thing on its own terms, understanding it, embracing it, What I love about the study of folklore is that it creates this middle space where that question is just not the most important question. Was it real or was it not? Is no longer the most important question. There are other much more interesting questions that you could focus on. Like if you tell a folklorist about a unicorn, they're not going to say, well, unicorns don't exist. Or they're not going to say, how can we find out if unicorns exist or not? How can we scientifically verify or rule out the possibility of unicorns? What they're going to say is, what do we know about unicorns? What can you tell me about unicorns? Let's learn all about unicorns. There's sort of almost a premise of a premise of believing in a unicorn because they're taking it seriously. They're holding it up as valuable to know about. And then they're also going to be asking, where do these stories show up? How do people feel about unicorns? What do unicorns mean to people? Why do unicorns matter? And those are such interesting questions, and so much more interesting, I think, than if you were just either confirming or ruling out a unicorn. You can become curious and bring your wonder into that conversation in a way that feels different. And I think that kind of like middle space also, personally, it helps me with biblical stories as well. Like, I honestly I'm not interested in saying decisively whether the narratives in the Bible clearly did or did not happen. Like, I tend to live in a sort of middle space where they simultaneously did and didn't. Like the Malagasy people, I consider them sort of jokes and tall tales on one hand, like Balaam the donkey speaking to his master and telling him how he really feels, And on the other hand, that they're true, and that I don't need to work hard to say, could they be factual or could they not be factual? Maybe they could. I wasn't there. I don't need to sit in judgment on that, right? So that middle space, I think, is a really interesting place to move. It's a really interesting place to let stories soak into you, take them on their own terms, see what you can learn from them, and just not be a referee all of the time, right? Not to have to be the umpire who's calling balls and strikes on whether a thing did or didn't happen, So there is this kind of malleable place in between where things may or may not be true. Especially when we talk about myth, when I said a minute ago, it's not just a synonym for false. There are some of these stories that can be at the same time both false and true. And that's interesting to me. I'd like to pivot now to talk about, we've been using these terms, but I'd like to provide a definition for them. Last week I was mentioning that Joseph Campbell is not the best person to be defining myths for us because he was coming from a literary perspective and he was coming from a psychoanalytic perspective, and he wasn't really aware of folklore and anthropology, which is the discipline. That's where to look if you want to understand cultural stories such as myths and legends. In the realm of folklore and anthropology, there are technical definitions for these types of stories. In the 1960s, the folklorist William Bascom brought the folklore discipline together on some definitions that he proposed that he felt like this seems like this is how we're using them. Let's all sort of come together and rally around these definitions. So myths are prose narratives which, in the society in which they're told, are considered to be truthful accounts of what happened in the remote past. And legends, meanwhile, are prose narratives which, like myths, are regarded as true by the narrator and his audience, but they are set in a period when the world was much as it is today. I really like these definitions because they push back against our knee-jerk assumption that myths and legends are essentially made up, right? In both of these definitions, core to each definition is the idea that in the cultures in which they're told, they're considered to be true, right? So when you think about what are our myths and legends, you have to pick stories that you and society largely considers to be true. So what is a story about the remote past that we consider to be true? Where can we find these in the wild? The Big Bang is a myth. The story of the Big Bang is a creation narrative. It's how the universe came to be. And granted, it doesn't have a God, benevolent or otherwise. It doesn't have, a lot of the things that we might assume are necessary for a creation story. But it is a creation story. It's a scientific narrative. It comes out of scientific research and theory. But it is a story by which we explain what happened in the remote past. I'm not commenting on whether it's true or false. Again, that's not really the point. The idea is this is the type of story that it is, and the thing that it's able to do for us in explaining where we came from. And these, obviously these myths can change, right? But that's probably our mainstream creation myth right there, the Big Bang. Looking more locally for an example of a legend, during the Neville era here at Good Sam, when Father Neville was making dramatic changes in our community and in the life of Good Sam, the Corvallis Hospital was going bankrupt. And Neville heroically reached out to the diocese and arranged for the resources to funnel in to save the hospital from going bankrupt. And now, today, as we drive around town, as we walk around town, we can see that name Samaritan, named for our church, on signs all over the community. We have Samaritan clinics, we have the Good Samaritan Regional Medical Center. That is because of the work that happened at that time to save the hospital. That's a legend. That is a true account of something that has really, clearly happened when the world is much as it is today, but that made a huge impact on the life and story and shape of our community. So as we move around, we can, I think about that legend, quote unquote, all the time. I think it's an incredible story, and it's a true story, and it's a story that helps to explain where Corvallis is now and our relationship to this community. And so it's interesting to me, the reason I bring these up is because it's interesting to retool our lens, our way of seeing, to be able to recognize where these stories are actually taking place and to step out of the frame of history is scientific and true, or whatever reliable and myth is always false and silly and recreational, right? It's quite a bit more interesting than that. I will say, these examples are kind of fun examples, right? The Big Bang is a fun creation story. It's not my favorite creation story of all the ones there are to choose from, but it's a fun one. And the legend of the hospital is also pretty great. But there are less fun ones that we can also see around. So, myth of progress is a cultural narrative that runs through, that is like so much a part of the water that we swim in. This image is kind of showing, I think it's called the two sides of progress, and is showing kind of two trajectories that are essentially sketching the same narrative. We start as apes, and then we move into this period of like proto-human, and then we progress from there. The top trajectory is, meditation and spirituality and science and intellect, the life of the mind. And then the bottom trajectory is, increasing technology, violence, warfare. And all of those things are part of the story of progress. The idea that we started as primitive and we're sort of advancing and becoming more complex, for better or worse, right? So this idea that humans are continually advancing is a narrative. Early in anthropology's history, it showed up as a classic and now completely debunked theory called the unilinear theory of cultural evolution, which is a mouthful, and which essentially is a version of myth of progress and a version of the same thing I've just been talking about that's problematic, where the idea was civilization always and ever progresses in stages and levels. So you start with, the idea goes, you start with this primitive sort of barbaric, you start with really primitive and then you move to barbarism. That's like one of the stages along the way. And then you move to this and you move to that and you eventually get to advancement and civilization. So at the same time as Charles Darwin was coming up with natural selection and the theory of evolution as we know from science, Lewis Henry Morgan, an anthropologist, and a couple of colleagues of his were coming up with this idea of what if society also develops in the same way, from sort of primitive and simple to advanced and complex? And of course, in his theory, he, writing from his culture, considered his own culture to be the most advanced and complex. And he considered other cultures to be, primitive or barbaric. That is not true. That's not how society or culture progresses or changes. That theory does not hold up. People who are native today are just as modern as anyone else. They're just as complex as anyone else. Their societies are just as sophisticated as anyone else's, even though they might take a different shape or have different solutions for the problems that we all face as humans. There's no such thing as like a society that's like a less evolved society. People are a lot more complex than that. People don't, we all are modern humans, and we all have complex ways of constructing our lives and interacting with one another. And we do that in very different ways. There are a lot of different ways to be human, a lot of different ways to do that. There's no culture that's isolated from these kind of global changes that we've all been part of, that we've all been interconnected with. There's a wonderful essayist, Walker Percy, who wrote about this in his article, The Loss of the Creature. So like you might go to a very remote village somewhere in Mexico, and you go into this person's their traditional hut, and then you see a New Yorker there on the on the floor, and you feel like you feel tricked because you're like they're not supposed to be modern, but of course if everybody's modern, right? But so this theory kind of shows up in all kinds of places. It has really deep roots. It goes way back. It showed up in the story of our nation's founding. This is a historical painting. I thought was kind of a parody when I first looked at it, because it's really over the top. But it's called American Progress, and of course we have this sort of angelic, almost Grecian lady who is moving across a landscape. We have behind her, she has brightness and beautiful weather. In front of her, she's moving toward the darkness. She's pushing the darkness back. She's chasing native people and buffalo and kind of the old way of being. She's chasing that off the canvas, and she is leading pioneers and other settlers to come and begin to farm and begin to take control of the land. She is literally carrying electrical wire with her. She is putting in a phone line or whatever else it is. I don't know, like electricity. She's followed by trains. It's one of those things I kind of had to see to believe. I mean, I knew Manifest Destiny existed, but until I saw this painting with this sort of angelic lady carrying, what is it? It's a book of, she's hiding the title. I can't see what it's entitled. And this was... And
of course her clothes are falling off.
Oh yeah, because she has to be super beautiful and sexy. Yeah, and this is a distilled example of how people during the colonial transition here in this country really viewed, their destiny, their clear and obvious manifest fate was to go and sort of drive out the barbaric and primitive people who pre-existed and come and create civilization here because of this idea of progress, this idea of systematic advancement. It was considered to be the clear and obvious, self-evident will of God for Euro-American people to come and claim the land and take control of it, and to push Native folks out. And that, what I would say is self-evident about that is the way in which that's harmful. It's not a good narrative, right? Lou, I think you had a question?
I'm looking at it. What really tells me the story is how light it is behind
Yeah.
her. She's
Yeah.
bringing light. You're bringing knowledge. You're
Yeah.
bringing improvement. You're bringing culture and civilization to these wild lands that are essentially dark and black and bad.
That's right.
Bad.
Yeah, that's right. There's a strong sense of good and bad, of light and dark, and she is at the forefront of this, But it is part of this idea of progress that was really part of that colonial movement, that movement to settle, to farm, to transform the land. So that belief in progress was very much top of mind for people. There was a general consensus about the idea of progress and in that era of time. And, we can kind of, from the comfort of our armchairs today, we can look back at Manifest Destiny and shake our heads and say, oh, it was so wrong. And indeed it was. It was very wrong. But this is something that's still with us. This narrative is still with us in the popular world. And you hear that in our language. You hear, people talking about backward societies or less developed societies. I mean, this story has not done with us yet. From my childhood, I recall watching a show called The Jetsons, in which there's a sort of utopic vision of what the future of technology will look like. And, and it's a fantasy and it's fun. But what we're seeing here is it's building on a cultural narrative, a cultural myth, a cultural pattern of myth of progress that is absolutely still with us. It's the idea that that we are ever and always moving forward, that technology is ever and always expanding, increasing, solving problems, creating wonders. This continues to show up in the narrative that science will fix it, that, we think about climate change. We think about the problems of the world that we're facing on our planet, and there is a narrative, there are a lot of places where that comes up, and people say, well, science will fix it. We don't have the answers now, but we'll get the answers. They'll come. We will figure out how to live at our current standard of living and not ruin the planet. That's a statement of faith. That's a statement that's based on a narrative that is shared. And I'm not saying science won't fix it necessarily. Maybe it will, but maybe it won't, right? Like maybe things are getting better, but also sometimes they get worse. Sometimes they get better in one way and worse in another way at the same time. And also how we define better and worse is a cultural question. It's not the case that there is a sort of direction of progress in which things started from sort of bad and are always and ever getting better. I think that progress is much, again, complicate that. I think it's much more complex. So these stories are really woven in or infused in the world that we live in. And when you start to notice them, when you start to notice where narratives show up, and what they're sort of connected to and how they're kind of revealing themselves in different contexts in different ways, it gets really interesting. Stories are not always good or true, but they are always with us. And this brings us to this fabulous word, Homo narrans. You've heard our species called Homo sapiens, which means the wise. I would say we're not always wise, but we are always telling stories. And narrans is related to the word for narrative. So in other words, Homo narrans means the storytelling primate, right? Which to me sounds like a really good description for what we are and what we do. Even, in every context of our lives, we are always telling stories. Stories are our primary tool for making sense of the experiences we're having and communicating with others and, moving through the world. I didn't make up the term. It was actually coined independently a couple of times, but the sort of narrative theory side of it was coined by a communication theorist called Walter Fisher as part of his development of a theory called the narrative paradigm, which goes into a lot of really fascinating detail about what narratives are, how we use them, why they're important to us, how they work. As we engage with the past, with where things are now and where we've been and how we got to be here and what it all means, we're going to be telling stories about that. We're going to be, and what I'll say is our narratives can be helpful or not, they can be true or not, they can be formal and disciplined and specific, or they can be more ephemeral and exchanged socially, exchanged culturally in the day-to-day. They can be specifically designed to unearth empirical truth, or they could be sort of not so concerned with that question, but still very much concerned with truth. There's a lot of different ways they can take shape, but this is largely how we explain the world to ourselves. It's how we explain our present world. It's how we explain the past. It's how we understand how we got here and who we are. And in that sense, they're always with us. We are storytelling creatures, first and last. So that's my whirlwind tour through narrative genre for today.